It's my great honor today to introduce Harold James as our speaker for today's talk on his most recent book, Seven Crashes, the Economic Crises that Shaped Globalization. As you all know, Harold is the Claude and Laura Kelly Professor in European Studies here at Princeton, Professor of History and International Affairs, and the Director of the Program in Contemporary European Politics. He has a glittering array of accolades and awards. He's the official historian of the International Monetary Fund. In 2004, he was awarded the Helmut Schmidt Prize for Economic History, and in 2005, the Ludwig Erhard Prize for writing about economics. His research spans many areas of history, economics, and finance, as we all know. In terms of the topic of today's talk on globalization, it's an area where he's made a whole series of fundamental contributions, including his 2001 book on the end of globalization, focused on the interwar period, and his later book, The Destruction of Value, The Globalization Cycle, and then, of course, the book that we're going to discuss today on Seven Crashes. Harold's book draws our attention to the complex interplay between institutions, technology, and globalization, and how insights from the past can inform present-day debates and controversies. The issues that it addresses are of particular importance as we look ahead and think about the future of globalization in the context of a resurgence of protection here in the United States, recent supply chain disruptions in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, geopolitical concerns such as tensions between China and the United States and the Russia-Ukraine war. Harold's going to aim to talk for around 35 minutes before then opening up to Q&A. And Harold, it's a great privilege and honor to hand the floor over to you.
So thank you so much, Steve. It's really wonderful to be back. As you know, I'm not really here this year. I'm in Berlin at the Institute for Advanced Study there. So it's wonderful to see the good weather and see so many friends. So let me talk a little bit about this book on seven crashes, turning points in the history of globalization. At the moment, I think, particularly at the moment, we're very, very confused, and there are all kinds of different narratives that are being thrown around, and contradictory narratives. And so I wanted to start a little bit with that, with the present. Is this advancing? Yeah, that looks good. Can I go back a few? Wonderful. Yes, there's this kind of apocalyptic sentiment that we're at the end of something, and Steve mentioned that already, and Steve's been involved very much in these debates about whether globalization is ending. In 2001, I did a book that was about the interwar collapse of globalization. Today, there's an abundance of literature on the end of globalization or the collapse of capitalism. I just wanted to throw out these fantasies that are going, the sort of fantasies of the collapse of everything, end of globalization, end of stable money, end of capitalism, end of macroeconomics, and focus particularly on the end of globalization story. In a way, this man is the poster child for that. Peter Navarro was a kind of enthusiastic free trader for a lot of his career, and really pushed the idea that free trade was contributing to prosperity and liberalization and making the world safer for democracy. And then as President Trump's trade advisor, he turned completely in the opposite direction and went with the attacks on globalization, the attacks on globalists, the argument that the COVID virus was the divine retribution for globalization, that globalization was the original sin that had produced COVID, and that it needed to be rolled back. But there are plenty of more sober people who make the same kind of argument. So last year, Larry Fink at BlackRock made that argument about the end of globalization. And the odd thing is that this is occurring at a moment when technology is changing more quickly than I think at any point over the last 50 or 60 years. And so we've got this tremendous technical advance, and it's an advance in biology, in medicine, in artificial intelligence, most strikingly. But how is that really compatible with this story of the end of globalization? Another figure who's addressed this very prominently, CIA Director William Burns, talks about this as being a plastic moment in which there's deglobalization, supply shocks. He talked about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, threats to Taiwan. I think you can add the Hamas attack as well, to the shocks that are threatening to divide the world into blocks, with people talking about fragmentation or friendshoring, or kind of softer version of that is de-risking. And then finally also inflation shocks. And inflation shocks are a major threat to political stability in many, many countries. So spectacular cases of inflation in Argentina or Turkey, but even the inflation that we're experiencing in the United States, or that Europeans are experiencing, is creating an enormous political backlash. So globalization, by some measures, was slowing down in the 2010s, but even that is controversial. So the headline fact that is often used to describe that process is that between the Second World War and the middle of the 2010s until 2014, world trade was consistently growing more quickly than world production. And from 2014 onwards, that relationship changed, and world trade was growing less than production. And so that's before the big shocks of 2016, the political shocks of the Brexit vote, which can be interpreted, I think, as an anti-globalization vote, and the Trump election. So it's before that turned to really big-scale protectionism. There's a substantial debate, and we may want to go into that in the question session, about whether this is really there, because there's a lot of argument precisely about this issue. I mean, this is a measurement of trade value, but the physical amount of trade measured in ton miles or ton kilometers has been growing all the time. And in addition to that, there's the completely weightless interconnection of the internet, and internet transactions haven't shown any sign of deglobalization. And some people will take this and say, well, actually, there's a peculiar explanation of it, which is just that if you measure value, any time that there's a big increase in the oil price, the value of trade goes up. And any time that there's a big decrease in the oil price in the middle of the 2010s, then the volume of trade, the value of trade goes down, but the volume obviously doesn't change. This photograph I took outside the National Bank of Poland in the summer, where they had a quite controversial poster, big placard outside the central bank. I don't know of any other central bank that's done something like this, which says that inflation in Poland is the result of the supply shocks of COVID, the aftermath of COVID, and it's the result of Russian aggression in Ukraine. And next to it, there's another side of the same thing, which says to accept any other story of the rise of inflation is to accept the false narrative of the Kremlin. So it's very, very politicized, but we have this uptick in inflation practically everywhere, a few exceptions. So that's really the background. that made me want to think about this in a longer term perspective. And what I want to do in the next 2 slides is to present the message of the book very, very simply. So just a kind of very, very back of the envelope presentation of what the book is about. This figure is this relationship between trade and world output, and you can see the wobbles as you get into the recent period. But I think you can also see that there are really 2 dramatic moments in which there's a big increase in trade, one in the middle of the 19th century, following the 1850s, and the other from the 1970s. So those are 2 of the turning points that I highlighted in the book. And you can also see the downturns, so massively the Great Depression, the aftermath of the First World War is this is odd actually, because the aftermath of the First World War politically created a lot more states. And so one of the things that is slightly odd about this is that this is just a measurement of international trade. And so if you get more states, you would expect actually there to be more trade because, for instance, Czechoslovakia and Hungary and Austria are all trading with each other internationally after 1919, whereas they'd done the same thing before the First World War. But then that wasn't international trade, that was in the Habsburg Empire. So this is surprising. This is even more surprising. 2008 looks as if it has many echoes of the Great Depression, and policymakers are aware of those kinds of parallels. So we've got moments when globalization goes down, moments when globalization goes up, and I wanted to try to summarize that. And so this is the verbal version of a back of the envelope postcard version of the story, that there are major supply shocks that in the end drive more globalization. And the historical ones are the 1840s and the aftermath of the 1840s and the 1970s. The 1840s, the way I think about that is to think of one country in particular, but that country is just the extreme example of it, the Irish potato famine in the middle of the 1840s, following a series of bad harvests and rainy weather, and the potato then rotting. But the potato was not just the staple crop of Ireland, it was also in Britain, it was also in the Netherlands, Belgium, northern Germany, across the European continent. And the lesson of that was very, very simply that Europe couldn't feed itself. And so it also demonstrated very, very dramatically the incompetence of governments. And so governments everywhere failed in the face of this supply shock. And the end result is political revolution. And so the revolution swept over Europe in 1848 and led to a really dramatic reassessment of what government was about. And the governments of the 1850s were not simple reactionary governments. There's a beautiful book by Christopher Clark that's just examined exactly that issue. Were not simply reactionary governments, but governments that thought about how to handle things better. So let me go back and just think about what exactly this distinction here between the supply shock and the demand shock. How can we tell which is which? I mean, in a way, this is very, very simple as well, kind of economics 101 approach to it. And so you can get at this by looking at prices and the amount of goods produced or the amount of goods sold. If there's a demand shock in the Great Depression, for instance, prices go down, sales go down, volume of goods traded goes down, everything goes down. If there's a positive demand shock, say in the 1960s, prices go up, sales go up, everything goes up. The characteristic of the supply shock is that the prices and the volume of goods or the value of goods move in different directions. So the prices increase in the 1840s, but the amount of goods go down. Or in the 1970s, the price of oil increases, but the amount of oil that's sold goes down. And so it's simply a business of looking at the big headline stories of price movements and the volume of trade or transactions. The 1970s, very, very similar story. And you can tell a story, I think also backstory of why you get to 1973 and the oil price, and it may come out of the big positive demand shock of the 1960s, but the result in 1973 and then repeated again in 1979 is evident. So what do these supply shocks do, and why do we expect, why is it reasonable to expect, and why am I going to give a kind of optimistic picture about what globalization is going to do in the future after the supply shock that we've been through? Well, the answer is that the supply shocks are the moments in which technology that is largely already there is taken up and used in a revolutionary way to transform the world and to meet exactly the causes of the supply problem. And so, just a little vignette of that for the middle of the 19th century, and then another one for the 1970s phase. In the middle of the 19th century, the steam engine had been around for a long, long time. There were steam engines in the early 18th century. The patent for the most famous advance in the steam engine from Matthew Boulton and James Watt is in 1776. Steam engines are quite widely used to pump water out of mines. And then in the 1820s, they begin to be applied to locomotion. But little bits. So the first British railroad is a tiny little stretch in Yorkshire between Stockton and Darlington. The first German railroad is between Nuremberg and Fürth. There are all kinds of political objections to having more railroads. Basically, they're not making the networked connections which make them so transformative from the 1850s onwards. And so it's only when you get networks of railroads that connect with each other, and then the steam engine applied to transoceanic shipping, that you really will see how you can get out of the hunger problem of the 1840s. A hunger problem where every government failed. So the British government thought of itself as being the most advanced government in the world, but it failed spectacularly in dealing with the humanitarian challenge of the Irish potato famine, because what they do at first is they say, okay, people are starving, we're going to provide food, we're going to subsidize food, and we're going to have buy food and supply it to everybody. Well, the effect of that is that it drives up the budget deficit and it drives up the trade deficit. The answer to that is that you need to increase the interest rates in the rules of the gold standard system. You increase the interest rates and you get a business recession. And then the aftermath of that is the government says, we can't afford this, we have to stop it. And so as the hunger is getting worse and as the epidemic diseases are spreading, the British government stops the provision of food to the starving people of Ireland. It's a grotesque failure of management of political economy. So you have to think of something different, some other better way of doing things. And it's the networked communications that allow that. In the 1970s, similar story, container shipping is, in theory, quite an obvious thing to do. There'd been a container ship already in the 1930s. From the 1950s onwards, regular container ship service between the port of New York and Florida. But that's not enough to create the networked effects. You need everybody to have container harbors, ports that are capable of dealing with containers. And so it's only when the cost of transportation rises because the oil price rises that you get an overcoming of all the political obstacles that existed to introducing container ports. And from the 1970s, the container revolution transforms the world. And if you want to see where I'm going with that, the optimistic picture is that the supply chain epidemic, the epidemic that caused the supply chain shocks after COVID, made us rethink the way we do some things. And for instance, I think there are some people online, for instance, for this this discussion. We had that technology, we could do that before, but the widespread adoption of that technology is only in the aftermath of COVID. Telemedicine, again, it's an obvious thing to do, but it's only with COVID that you start to do that. Working from home, clearly for many people a desirable thing to do, but only after COVID could you do this. And so, the consequences of this are really transformative for education. I don't know how many of you have experimented with something like the Khan Academy. If you look at that, you can see this amazingly effective course, a really sophisticated calculus course that explains it much, much better than any teacher I ever had at school could do. And that's available free to anybody in the world who has an internet connection. Medicine, you can potentially revolutionize the way in which we do medicine. And these were things, education, medicine, housing, that were getting more and more expensive and were oppressing in advanced industrial societies, the middle classes. They're being transformed. The mRNA vaccine itself is a kind of demonstration of the same effect like the steam engine or the container ship. The mRNA vaccines were around in some form from the 1990s. And the thought is that they can be used to fight really rare tropical diseases. And so it's very, very quick in the aftermath of the identification of the COVID virus, of the coronavirus, that you use the mRNA vaccine and produce at an amazing speed widely distributed vaccine. And then you realize that this can be also used for other common diseases, deadly diseases, in fact, for some forms of, some common forms of cancer. So we're really at this revolutionary moment. That really is the story of why we should expect supply chain problems to revolutionize the world. But also, at the same time, when you're talking about supply chains, there's also a push and a feeling that these can be politically instrumentalized. And so there are all kinds of shortages that come up immediately after COVID. Chips. We had a great book talk last year with Chris Miller's wonderful book on chip wars, semiconductors. But energy looks like the classic one. You don't need to think back. Everybody really remembers the 1970s, or remember stories of the 1970s. So it's very obvious that you can, if you have a supply of energy, you can instrumentalize that. And so, maybe you think most obviously of Russia when I talk about that, but it's not just Russia, it's an obvious move. So for instance, Algeria supplies gas to Spain, and Spain resells some of the gas to Morocco. They're locked in a conflict about the Western Sahara. And then in the midst of this supply shock, Algeria says, we're going to suspend the supplies to Spain unless you stop selling the gas to Morocco. So instrumentalizing it is everywhere, and more countries realize, or political actors, it don't need to be a country to do this, realize that they can use supply scares to change the world. So it becomes a scary world, but it becomes a world also in which the technology holds out things. I wanted also in the book, you will see if you care to look at the book, that each chapter on each of these turning points has not only an account of the crisis and a classification, whether it's a supply shock or a demand shock, or whether it's confusingly and destructively both in the case of the First World War. It has not only that, but I also try to analyze the way in which these shocks change the way in which people think about economics. And so I identify a little bit arbitrarily. I could in some cases have taken different figures. In some cases, for instance, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, it's very obvious that you can't write that story about how economics is transformed without thinking about Keynes. But some of the other choices, you might say, well, why did you choose this person rather than that person? But again, I think this kind of classification is interesting in that it shows the way in which different themes come to the fore. And so the first figure that I take, the first great analyst, as it were, of the revolutions of the political revolutions and the economic revolutions of the 1840s is Karl Marx. Again, I think a sort of obvious figure to take. And Marx thought that, very much in terms of those slides at the beginning, that at these moments of supply shocks, we live in a kind of apocalyptic world in which we think we're at the end of times and everything is collapsing. And that's certainly very much the message that Marx had in the late 1840s. And then in the 1850s and 1860s, as he sees the response to globalization, he's more and more aware that it needs to be analyzed. And so he sat there in the British Museum reading room in what's now the British Library, in the Great Dome of the British Library. He sat there day after day after day for years, copying out tables of figures from the newspapers, from the London Times or from the quite recently then published Economist. And you can see those in his notebooks. He copies out these tables of figures and stares at them and wonders how he can get a relationship between them. And he's aware that there are mathematical ways of getting at an understanding of the relationship between different movements. And he often invokes, as a kind of iconic figure, the Belgian mathematician Alphonse Quetelet, and says, if we really use the methods of Quetelet, we can get the laws of motion of modern society. In the same reading room, and that's the figure for the next iconic economist, is the man who actually gave economics its modern title, because he said, the previous title, still in many British universities and in titles of chairs, is political economy. But Stanley Jevons said, why do you have this political thing? Why don't we just call it economics, not political economy? But Jevons, sort of similar look with a big beard, was sitting there in the same reading room, making the same kind of analysis, but actually had the mathematical tools in order to give a solution to it. And oddly, at exactly the same time, and kind of really not correlated with each other at all, because they weren't aware of each other's work until both of them had published it. In France, or in the Francophone world, sometime in Geneva, Léon Walras has the same kind of exercise. And what is the upshot of that? I think that in these moments of the aftermath of supply shocks, you think very much in terms of the adjustment of prices, what prices are trying to tell you. And this is the moment that gave rise to the marginal revolution, to Walras or Jevons, or less mathematically, to Karl Menger in Austria. By contrast, the big demand shock moment, the Great Depression or 2008, they give rise to a very different kind of thinking, in which people have to think about big aggregates. And so it's Keynes thinking about aggregate demand, it's Keynesians thinking about aggregate demand, neo-Keynesians, new Keynesians in the aftermath of 2008. Because it's an obvious case. You've got a shortfall in demand and you need to fill it, and any kind of filling is good. So you just think of the aggregates, or it's not just Keynesians who think like this. It's Milton Friedman is concerned about stabilizing the aggregate of the money supply. He's not concerned so much with the fine adjustments. I think you can think of the difference in the Great Depression or in 2008. It's really important, in order to get a stabilization of society, that you get extra demand, or that you stabilize the money supply. In the aftermath of a supply shock, it's not at all obvious that that's the right answer. And so that turned out to be the wrong answer in the 1970s. It turned out to be the wrong answer in 2020, because you've got a much bigger fiscal stimulus, particularly in the United States, than you had in 2008, with much less of a reason to do it. And then the argument is, well, you don't need aggregate demand. You need very, very specific kinds of products that are made in these circumstances. You need vaccines, or you need microchips, or you need, before you had the vaccines, protective medical equipment, face masks, all of that. And you can't get that by injecting more aggregate demand. If you inject aggregate demand, you'll just get a demand for other things, for all the things that we consumed in such a big way in 2020 and 2021. And so the argument at the end says, what are we looking at today? We're looking at a resurgence of microeconomics and thinking about the particularities of adjustment rather than filling in the big gaps in demand. So the overall message is that the way in which we interpret economics is enormously important in each of these events. And I thought I might just quote the last page, the last sentence of the book, which is a quotation from Keynes in 1919, when the world was really very, very gloomy. Keynes wrote then that he feared all this makes it increasingly probable that things will have to get worse before they can get better. Things will have to get worse before they can get better. And my gloss on that is that we learn most when things are at their most dismal. So we are indeed at the moment right in the middle of a absolutely fantastic and transformative learning process. And thank you.
Absolutely fascinating. I wondered in terms of that you thought about other possible shocks. So one that came to my mind was the sort of 1980s fall of the Iron Curtain, and then just before that, China opens up to the world economy. And a lot of economists have sort of argued that especially rapid globalization, on the chart you showed towards the beginning, is really in part driven by that kind of emergence of China in particular and Eastern Europe into world markets. And that kind of, I guess it's also a supply shock, and it kind of connects with geopolitics, the role of geopolitics in shaping globalization, which then also becomes very relevant thinking about things today and as we go forward, where geopolitics and in particular US-China rivalry could play a critical role in shaping the pace of globalization. So I was kind of curious for your thoughts on that as another possible shock and how you think about global geopolitics.
I mean, in some ways, the 1970s were a moment of geopolitics as well. You know, I think your question is terrific and really important. But I kind of worry a little bit when people say that you find it very, very often now. I mean, I think if you're asked, if people in the street, or sophisticated people in the street, are asked to give the date when China became a threat, they will characteristically say 2001. So it's the entry into the WTO that is the transformative moment. But, you know, my story is really that Deng Xiaoping, in the end of the 1970s, thinks that something's gone wrong with China's model of development and that they need to do something different. And so there's this fantastically influential visit that Deng had to Singapore, and he looks at Singapore. And you know, Singapore is obviously an autocratic regime, but one that is very, very connected into the world. And he says, you know, this is the way that we're going to manage our future. And so, you know, the story of China after 1979 seems to me to be a story of China moving into globalization, and then a story in 2008 where, you know, when you think of demand stabilization, China is the big demand stabilizer in 2008 with the 4 trillion renminbi program. China's just nailed the, you know, what could have been the Great Depression. I mean, the Fed as well. Of course, you know, there are lots of things that go right in 2008. But China is an important part of that. And then, there's a great photograph that I really love of the April 2009 London G20 summit, where you know, in the front row there's President Obama and the then Russian President, President Medvedev, and they're being gripped in a kind of iron embrace by the political clown who led Italy at that moment. So Berlusconi is sort of smirking and pulling them together. And one row above is Hu Jintao, and you see on Hu Jintao's face that he's sort of not concerned with this kind of clownish story. And then what happens, I mean, I think an interesting story, and one that I'd like to explore a bit further, is that you know, China thought that the reward for doing that, or Hu Jintao thought the reward for doing that would be that China would have a greater role in international institutions. It doesn't get that. And the consequence is that the successor to Hu Jintao President Xi, just moves China in a very, very different direction. But it's in a way a kind of expression of a frustration about the globalization governance. But also I think on all the things that China does, it's not deglobalizing. And even the story that's often presented as the fact of deglobalization is that the share of the US and Chinese trade is reduced, but actually the amount of trade is increasing still. And then there was this beautiful paper by Laura Alfaro where she shows that actually, even that is misleading, because all that's happening is that China is selling more to Vietnam and to Mexico, and then that we're importing more from Vietnam and Mexico. So, I think the China story is very nicely explained actually by reactions to both the 1970s and the 2008 story. And in that sense, I find 2001 overrated in the literature.
Thanks, Harold. That's terrific. Other questions? Michael?
Harold, I want to get back to that. We've talked a lot about this before, but I want to get back to the fundamentals. You talk about the difference between invention and innovation. Okay, so the steam engine's invented, but it isn't really used until something happens. So what drives the invention? I mean, why? It's like you're saying these things are lying around. We grab them, but where do they come from? And why are they being developed? I guess that's what my question.
I think that's a good question, but it's a different one to the one that I'm thinking about in the book, and so I would kind of say, this is the result of all kinds of things. It's a kind of Joel Marquis story of how you have an inventive society that is tinkering and producing all kinds of instruments, and the steam engine is just one of those. The mRNA vaccine, I think, is a consequence of just enormous research expenditure on every kind of biotech story, and many of them end up as failures, of course. But this is something that's lying around and is then capable of being taken up, and so I'm much more concerned about the taking up moment, and I'm not so concerned really about why Newcomen had this very early steam engine, or why Watt and Bolton didn't manage to propagate their idea more broadly. I think the interest is for me at least in this way in which these become really revolutionary instruments at the moment when they're taken up in a big way. And it's also, all of these things, the characteristic of them is that they only work if they're taken up by lots and lots of people. So if 5 people would have the mRNA vaccine, that would be nice for them, but it wouldn't do any good to anybody else. So the whole thing depends on lots of people being vaccinated. It's an exactly fine illustration of the network effect.
I'm very curious what you meant. I can guess, but the Summers versus Chetty, the very bottom corner. What was how do you characterize? Oh, sorry.
Well,
what do you characterize as each of their positions on whatever sort of response?
I think it's in a way very simple. Summers is, in a way for me, the living embodiment of Keynes updated. And so he's got the analysis in 2008 of a sort of nicely calculated amount, and in retrospect may have been too little, of the amount of the fiscal stimulus that you needed in 2008. He's there in 2020 to say that you need an immediate fiscal stimulus, but then he's very, very quick to see that both the Trump and particularly the Biden story are overdone, and so he's the big critic of the fiscal stimulus on classic Keynesian grounds. And I could have selected many, as you know, many other microeconomists, but the idea was to have somebody who was in the same institution, had a completely different way of doing it, and it says that, you know, what you need to do if you want to fight the big social problems is not to think about fiscal stimulus, but we need to know exactly what the education, the income levels are in different parts of a city. So, you know, this kind of wonderful stuff that you can do with Chetty's maps, where, you know, you see the part of Baltimore is very, very prosperous, and, you know, just a few miles away, parts of Baltimore are just appallingly impoverished. And
the nature of the supply shocks.
no.
The Bella Weber,
Mm-hmm.
or who's made these arguments that we should think about this more as like coming out of World War II. But I think I understand what your point is.
Yeah. But exactly, I mean, the kind of problems that that Chetty is dealing with are problems that are not really capable of being tackled by a big change of fiscal policy or a big change of monetary policy. So he's not interested in that kind of issue. And, you know, in the same way that, you know, fundamentally, Jevons or Walras are not interested in that kind of problem either.
Any other questions?
Nice presentation, Harold. I just wanted to have all these positive stories that, you know, whenever there's a supply shock, we get the corner and we turn around. You know, I can also imagine that there's some non-linearities in these supply shocks, you know, either when the supply shocks are very low or very high, so that we might not get the corner at some point. If you look back further in history, you see some supply shocks where in some countries we didn't get the corner and things, the whole system collapsed, you know, the Holy Roman Empire collapsed or something like that. Perhaps I don't want to destroy your positive picture too much, but just to have as a counterbalance also where a supply shock, you know, was not then overdone with even more positive things coming forward on a global scale.
A supply shock that absolutely devastates a society and where it's unanswerable. I mean, I think the I can't really give you an example. Well, I can. I can give you an example of sort of basically misapplied policies in the face of a supply shock. And you know, the story in the 19th or the 20th century is that there are very, very many different political systems, and they produce different answers to it. So, you know, the story of the 19th century is you see that there's been this big shock. You want to learn how to respond to it, and then you know, the most characteristic expression of that, I think, is the way that Japan sent these experts all over the United States and Europe to look at what the United States did, what France did, what Britain did, what Germany did, and try to draw lessons from that. And then they're institutionalized in the 1870s. And you know, I think in the same way, in the 1970s, you could see that the United States or the UK produced rather poor responses to the supply shock, and Germany and Japan let the prices work and adjusted more quickly. And so they become then the models that are attractive for other countries. And so nobody is going around in the 1980s saying, let's study the UK and let's model our institutions after the UK. I mean, that's also, I think, actually, you know, part of the answer to Steve's question, or that has a big impact on Eastern Europe as well in the 1980s. And so it's driving the search for a transformation long before the collapse of communism. So I mean, you do see societies that don't respond very effectively, I think, is the answer. And, you know, then you get a kind of regime change.
Just any other comments or questions?
One in the corner.
Gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Thank you. I have two questions. The first is on the current crisis, or the Ukraine war and the COVID. And you put the driver as a supply, not great power competition. Now, suppose we imagine a scenario after Ukraine being invaded by Russia. The United States says, oh, Russia, you go sell oil as you want. No sanction. It seems that the outcome will be completely different. How would you separate? My point is, how do you separate great power competition versus a supply in Ukraine case?
Right.
Yeah. And my second question is very short. It's I forgot the precise words you used. You said that in the case, at least in great power competition, the competitors, they respond to the crisis. And my question is, do you see a convergent trend of that reaction that we can almost predict if the next crisis comes, how these great power will react?
Well, the second one requires an enormous amount of investigation, but also imagination, and I think many people won't like to get pinned down into giving precise answers. But the first question, I think, is very, very clear to me, which is that there is a link between COVID and the escalation of geopolitical tensions, and it's the way that the supply chain shocks really become prominent, so everybody thinks about them. And then if you're controlling a particular supply chain, or if you're not controlling a particular supply chain, in both cases you get really worried about it. And you need to take some action to do that. So, China is worried then about where it's going to get the energy supplies from, or where it's going to get the rare earths from, and so it pushes its programs. But I think also, what that kind of story does is to illustrate the way in which things are really completely not thought about in advance. And so in a way, it's the answer to your second question, that we can't possibly know all the linkages. So for instance, after COVID, there was the big semiconductor shortage, and in part because ships are not sailing to the right places. But then when you get an additional element, when 24th of February, 22, Russia attacks Ukraine. Only after that is there any discussion, as far as I'm aware, that the production of semiconductors depends on neon gas. And neon gas is a product of a particular kind of steel production that we don't really do in the United States, or the Europeans don't do, but both Ukraine and Russia were the big exporters of neon gas. And so you suddenly need to substitute, and you can substitute, you can find answers, but you have to look around for solutions. And so everybody is then thinking about supply chains and how we're vulnerable. But fundamentally, it's a very, very difficult exercise to do, because also one of the things that became very clear in COVID that I think was known before, but was the extent to which we're dependent on, if we want to have antibiotics, on generics that are produced in India, but most of the generics in India are also sourced with supplies from China. And so China is at the heart of the supply chain for a lot of pharmaceutical products. So, just thinking about that, and thinking about the way in which it can be used for power play is, my belief is that COVID really accentuated the polarization and the fragmentation of the world.
Thank you very much. very much, Harold, for just a fascinating presentation and questions and discussion. Thank you very much.